This unit, we are continuing our discussion on interview practices. We're talking about embodied, mediated, and focus group approaches in our qualitative research methods class. I am Dr. Anita Black, your professor for this course. Here is our overview for the week. We will be discussing conducting face-to-face interviews, technologically mediated interviews, focus group interviews, overcoming common challenges, and transcribing. So let's recall from the last unit where we discussed everything that went into the planning and designing of an interview, such as the structuring, the wording, and questioning of our interview. In this unit, we're moving on now to actually executing the interview from before until after the interview takes place. The first question that we need to deal with is the where question of interview logistics, because the first decision that we need to make is the location of our interview. When we're choosing a location for the interview, we need to consider the participants' access to location, including the availability of parking and whether the location is within a reasonable commute time for the participant. We also need to select a quiet place with few distractions, but we need to balance the need for quiet with the need for the participant to feel comfortable in the space. So for instance, let's say you have access to an empty office and you're going to conduct your interviews there. Well, certainly the office space will be quiet because there's no one else occupying the building, but will your participant be comfortable in the space? If the space is going to remind them of walking into this, horror film with no one around and low lighting, they might not be as comfy. So maybe instead, visit your, take your participant to a local coffee shop like Starbucks. And while we're discussing coffee shops, another piece of advice pops up is to scout out the location ahead of time. If you choose to interview somebody at a Starbucks or another kind of restaurant, you need to take your audio equipment there ahead of time and just let it record the environment around you. Ask yourself, are there too many people talking? Are there too many plates clanking from the kitchen? If so, you might want to consider a different location, because if you record an interview, but then you later cannot hear the interview, then you have wasted a lot of time and effort. Next, we need to consider the actual and perceived safety of the space. So, for example, is there adequate lighting? While we may want to embed ourselves in the environment that the participant operates in, circumstances actually may call for a different place. If we feel unsafe, clearly we want to be able to ensure adequate privacy for our participant, especially if he or she is sharing a confidential or sensitive information with us. And again, we should choose somewhere that the participant feels comfortable and where we feel comfortable too. If you're going to be sitting for a long period of time, it might be nice to have some padded seats, a nice backing to your seat. It might be nice to have coffee nearby. You can take a break if you need to. And finally, we need to make sure that we have access to electricity. And this may sound silly, but if you're going to need to plug in your recorder or your laptop, and I don't know how many times that I have gone to Panera Bread just to drink coffee and work on my computer, only to find there were no seats near an outlet. So if you're working with a partner or if you have an assistant, it might be a good idea to give them some money to purchase coffee and go reserve a seat or a table for you, maybe an hour or so ahead of the time. Now, if you're going to be using a public eatery like a Starbucks or a Panera, here's a little bit more interview logistics. Researchers need to make decisions about auto recording that effective recordings have audible voices and technology that's functioning correctly. So your audio equipment should be tested before the interview and during the interview. Researchers need to have some sort of non-obvious method for checking that your equipment is working during the interview. Maybe Check to see if the timer on the recording is still running, or if you have that little red button that's lit up, just make sure that it's still on. If you're recording on a computer, you may also be able to see the sound patterns that pop up. And bring backup recorder. Think of this, that 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So if you have one means of recording and it isn't functioning properly, you have just wasted all of your time. So be safe and have some sort of backup. And also take notes. This should be obvious by now, but you need to make notes not just of what has been said, but also the nonverbal cues that we talked about that your participant is sending. You may also want to refer back to your notes that you've taken to seek any clarification on a topic later on in the interview and you may think of a new question that you'd like to ask along the way that you hadn't considered before when you were preparing. And so if you jot that down, then you can go back and look at that and ask them something. Now, on to the day of the interview. You should arrive at the location early. So to set up, as Tracy points out in the book, it's natural to feel a little bit nervous. In all likelihood, your participant will also feel nervous. So when he or she arrives, make a point to smile and welcome the participant. Sometimes you can just see the participant's anxiety melting away when you do this. This is also a perfect time to start your interview, as the slide notes here, that you need to begin the interview with a briefing of the purpose of the interview and the expected length of the interview. We talked about this some in the last unit. So starting off your interview this way might also serve to put the participant at ease. And as I noted before, remember that the interview doesn't only start when the participant starts talking. Take notes on their facial expression, their appearance, their clothing, and really anything else about them that you may think is relevant later. Maybe something that will spark something that you remember just by taking some brief notes. So let's talk about the qualities of a good interviewer. First, a good interviewer should be knowledgeable on the topic of their study, as well as knowledgeable about the participant. The more knowledgeable you are about the participant, the more likely you are to understand what they're talking about, and the more likely you are to be able to ask insightful follow-up questions. Also, a good interviewer should be purposeful and clear. I think I struggle most with this quality sometimes because I have so many things to say that it's hard to keep them clear. And this is one reason I take pretty good detailed notes when I do these discussions, these lectures. I have I need a guide to help me structure my questions. So it's good to have one, especially in an interview. A good interviewer should also be gentle and forgiving. Your interview is not a place for judgment, even if your research is meant to bring about social change. Meet the participant where they are, and remember that we all have faults. So try to avoid displaying shock or dismay at things that the participant tells you. Further, a good interviewer should be sensitive to the possible emotional shifts in the conversation. Pay attention to your participant. Make note of their mood, and don't push too hard if doing so will subvert the purposes of the interview. You need to be noticeable of, like we said, the nonverbal cues in your participant. A good interviewer should be open-minded, not judgmental. Be open-mindedness. The researcher should accept that his or her perspective is not the only one that exists. Remember that qualitative research is a two-way street of meaning that you can take away just as much or more than the participant about the way the things are from the interview. Next, a good interviewer should be attentive and curious. Nothing shuts down a good discussion like the appearance of boredom. If you give off a feeling of curiosity and energy, your participants are likely to pick up on that and give it right back to you. If you show that you're really interested in this and it's something that they're comfortable with and they're knowledgeable about, they're going to talk more openly. A good interviewer should be skilled in interpreting. It may be that your participant is an expert, so if you need to make a point to have them explain concepts that they understand in layman's terms. And finally, and this sums up all of the preceding qualities, A good interviewer should be an active listener. So the point of these interviews is not simply to sit back and ask questions and receive answers, but as the interviewer to engage with the participant. Here are a few more qualities of good interviewers. Remember that good interviewing is much more than just asking questions. We discussed before about paying attention to the participants' nonverbal cues, but make a point to consider your own nonverbal behavior and what signals it might send out to the participant. At the end of the interview, you should thank the participant, and you should also turn off your recorder at the end and ask if there's anything else the interviewee would like to share with you. As soon as a participant leaves and you say goodbye to him or her, there are a few other tasks that you need to do. First, you need to verify that the audio recorder was working, and if not, you need to immediately start writing field notes about the interview. And take any additional notes about the scene or the interview that will aid during transcription of the interview. You want to write down anything that you observed that maybe you didn't write down earlier, and write down your view and what you saw right then and there when it's fresh in your mind. Let's turn our attention now briefly to mediated interviews. Mediated interviews do not occur face-to-face, but via some type of mediated technology. These can be asynchronous or synchronous. A synchronous interview exchanges information at the same time, like a synchronous class where you would have to attend personally. So imagine if you're talking via telephone or webcam, and so using Zoom or Skype, it's something that lives that's live on both hands. Asynchronous interviews can exchange information at different times, such as via email or in-first mediated interviews. You can do this through email, Facebook, even text messaging. Let's talk about the strengths of mediated interviews. They are cost effective for reaching participants that are geographically distributed. So maybe it's the case that not everybody lives where you do, and someone that you want to interview is in another part of the country, for instance. So rather than traveling to the other part of the country, meet somebody over Zoom. Have that type of conversation instead of spending money on a plane ticket. Mediated interviews also encourage increased participation and sharing. Sometimes people might feel a little bit more comfortable in the safety of their own home while they're talking with you. Asynchronous approaches, in particular, provide participants with the flexibility and the ability to give more detail in their answers. So our interviews in person may be limited in the amount of time that we have, but with a mediated interview, perhaps it could be scheduled at a time when there's a lot of availability with an open time frame. It's possible that more information and more detail could be provided by the interviewee in mediated interviews. Power differences can be evened out and equal participation is encouraged. Participants may be more social and friendly because they control their own personal presentation. Because some forms of mediated interviews like email and text are text-based. These can provide data that's missing from another approach, such as the participant's grammar and spelling skills. And in some cases, mediated interviews allow the participants to purchase less equipment. So let's talk about now the disadvantages of mediated interviews. First, mediated interviews provide mediocre embodied nonverbal data. So we might not be able to see the person that we're talking to at all. Like if a question that you asked has made somebody uncomfortable, then you don't get that reaction from them. In fact, in asynchronous mediated interviews, it may be that you don't get quite an honest response because it's sort of an initial emotional reaction to the question, and that goes away when you can't see them. Where the person may wait until they've got a cooler head to really answer you. They may pause and you don't really understand why. So this is a definite disadvantage of a mediated interview. Also, mediated interviews require the participant to have some technological knowledge and access. If you are maybe speaking to someone that just can't afford a computer, doesn't have one, or a phone, maybe somebody that's older and they're just not used to using computers, you're not going to be able to carry on this type of interview participant. As I know from students, for instance, participants are also likely to become distracted during mediated interviews. So there's a possibility that while you're asking them questions, that they're also looking at something else on the internet, and maybe you don't get quite as good a response from the questions as you ask with synchronous approaches in particular. I know that imagine if this was actually a live lecture and you're sitting there in front of your computer, how many times do people, if you're in Zoom, turn off their picture? So you don't know if you've lost your audience or if they're actually, really interested in paying attention to what you're saying. Particular attention or just dropping out can be a real problem for these mediated interviews because maybe you're not holding the participants' attention long enough, as I said, and they just decide, I'm done with this. There's also the possibility that mediated interviews provide lower levels of confidentiality. So, for instance, participants are more likely to be able to share copies of their interviews with others than they would be if you were just conducting a normal face-to-face interview. So in that instance, it's actually the participant themselves that is giving up their own confidentiality. Another disadvantage of mediated interviews is that cleaning and organizing data can take a long time. This is true to some extent from normal style interviews as well, but especially for asynchronous mediated interviews where answers don't come back immediately and you have to kind of keep a timeline of events. I could see where that could be an issue, or just trying to sync things up, but cleaning and organizing data can take a long time. Identity verification can also be an issue, especially in chat rooms. It can be difficult. So are you actually talking to someone that is eligible for your study, or are you just talking to maybe an older person that's bored and lonely, or someone that's trying to actually purposely mess up your study? People can hide their identity a little bit better, especially if you can't see them. I just think in general about media interviews, there's maybe a misconception that it's easier to conduct them because you can just stay at home, be on your computer, but this isn't necessarily the case. I think that because of all of these challenges that we've mentioned here, it's a different sort of animal. And I think there are different obstacles to clear. And I really do think maybe the biggest one is that people are easily distracted, whereas if you were face-to-face with somebody, you might be able to keep their attention better. So just as a wrap up here, please see the Tips and Tools 8.1. It covers both the advantages and the disadvantages of mediated interviews. So let's move on now to the focus groups. So what is a focus group? Maybe you've heard about them, trying out or testing out a new product, but maybe you're just not really quite sure what one is. Well, a focus group is a group interview with 3 to 12 participants. And if you take a look at your book in Appendix B, you'll find a focus group moderator script. And maybe that'll help you explain what a focus group is better. If you're not sure what focus groups help to gather, they gather the data on the group effect and the group interaction. They can also be really useful for generating what the book calls in vivo speech. One of the real advantages of focus groups is that it can raise participants' consciousness about issues. So in many focus groups, you've invited people of different walks of life and maybe people from different political sides of the aisle. By exposing one set of participants to another, it may be that your participants really learn something from the other side. In addition, focus groups serve as a mini interaction laboratory. So you are able to test out on a very small scale how people how people interact with one another. And maybe from that, you can draw a larger inference to how maybe groups participate and interact with each other on a larger societal scale because of the number of actors that participate in focus groups and because of the looser type of format that you will use. Focus groups can also facilitate creative types of data collection, such as polls, written surveys, asking for metaphors, performance, and artistic approaches. Focus groups also provide an excellent way to engage in action research, where participants address a problem but then all work together to resolve it. You may also want to use focus groups to study how certain groups react to a similar issue or a shared experience. So rather than, again, receiving just one side of a story, you're able to receive a lot of different responses and maybe piece together a larger picture of what's happened. With that being said, though, when participants have different individual experiences, focus groups are not the best method to use. So you don't want to be in a focus group where you're basically comparing apples and oranges the whole time. You need to make sure that there's some commonality between the members of the focus group. We're going to go through these fairly quickly, as you can read for yourself in the book. I don't want to make this lecture any longer than it has to be. These are the tips for planning focus groups, and see in your book on Tips and Tools 8.2 for a more detailed description of these. We want to determine the most effective format. We need to determine the appropriate length. We have to decide on the number of participants for the focus group. We need to determine if we're going to pay or compensate participants in any way. We need to think about what paying or compensating someone will actually do to our study and to their participation. People maybe tell us things that they think we want to hear because we're giving them something. We need to consider the use of strategic groupings. So should we have sort of breakout sessions? We need to figure out what facility will be used, and we have to consider the room size of tables and chairs set up. As we said before, we need to look at the availability and positioning of technology and electricity. So are we going to be able to use our recording equipment in our computers, or are we able to use the equipment that's available in the room? We need to give our focus group, we need to see how long our focus group is going to run. If it's going to run long, we need to have a refreshment area, a break room, access to restrooms. In a focus group, members are being driven to the site. So do we need to have a waiting room for their guests if they're driven to the site? For those that drive them, do we need a place? Are there any other accessibility issues that we need to consider, especially maybe for any handicapped participants in our study? Let's shift our discussion now to the people that are actually running the focus group. So we have a number of roles. We need the host, facilitator, a field note recorder, and a technology assessment. At the very least, we need to create a screening questionnaire to make sure the people in the focus group are qualified and are the people that we want to be questioning, as with we would do with a one-on-one interview. It's a good idea to have a facilitator script or question guide to sort of focus the question in the direction of the conversation. And before we begin the focus group, we need to get confirmations. We need to contact participants ahead of time to confirm that they will be participating. The worst thing in the world would be to spend all of your time organizing this and setting up the space and then have no one show up. Let's talk now a few tips for facilitating your focus group. You need to know your discussion guide inside and out. It's probably a good thing to look for and pair them to have an internalize the guide. You need to know what questions you're going to ask. It's okay to refer back every now and then, but you don't want to be reading it like a script. You may want to consider ahead of time some of the tangents that your participants may go off on. How are you going to steer them back into the conversation that you want? And especially consider any controversial issues that may come up during your discussion that you want to downplay. Consider your entire your attire and your identity characteristics and what effect you as the interviewee will have, or the focus group facilitator will have on the participants as their facilitator. You need to use a mix of listening and leading. You're the one that has invited these people here, so you need to give them guidance. You need to be in control of the group. You want to always seek clarification within the group, provide any feedback, ask probes, and always have follow-up questions. Make a point to include everyone in the discussion. Make sure that even the quiet participants speak up. As we've said before, it's probably a good idea to use some humor to lighten the mood. But we also want to avoid jargon and judgment. So you don't want to seem overly technical, and you don't want to seem like you're judging or looking down on one thing. You may want to do a thorough overview, and you may risk sounding redundant, but summarize what individuals have said. Make sure that the other participants understand where an individual is or coming from on a certain topic, and really what they're trying to say. And by doing this, you may illuminate the fact that you didn't understand what the participant said, so maybe they'll correct you. You want to make sure that the focus group knows that you're listening, but avoid lots of head nodding. Allow for strategic breaks throughout the focus group. Make a point to close by asking for confidentiality before the participants leave the room, and make sure that they're not going to discuss what has been the subject of the focus group. It may be that they're going to talk to somebody else that is part of your focus group or part of your study in some way, and you as the leader of the focus group want to protect the identity of the people that have participated in your study and any confidential issues that have been discussed. Take time after participants leave to debrief and plan for the next focus group. So what were the big highlights that was said? What did you see as most important? What did your participants react to? Maybe this is a good time to write down their nonverbal cues that you didn't do during the group. If you're going to provide compensation to those that are participating in group, of course, this is when you would do that. The remainder of this lecture or discussion is overcoming interview and focus group challenges and transcribing. I'm going to go over these sections a little bit faster, but I think in particular this section can be and is very important. One challenge is to expect the unexpected. You never know how your participant is going to behave, so don't just assume that you're going to sit down, ask questions to your interviewee or your focus group, and that you're just going to receive simple answers or the answers you expect. You need to prepare ahead of time for emotional responses and possibly even confrontation from your interviewee or your focus group members against you or against each other. And remember that you as a researcher, you have your own actions and your own appearance, and it may negatively affect the interview in some way. So again, you need to think about yourself, be self-reflexive in your interview. Be sure to think ahead of time about troubles that may come out of the phrasing of your questions, or maybe even the ordering of your questions. Make sure that your questions have a coherent path, that they lead in a certain direction, not to a certain answer, but to a certain direction. If you have time before the interview or before the focus group, it's advisable to practice and write out methods for probing and following up on. We've said it several times, but be compassionate, be empathetic, understand that everyone has faults, unless you're trying to provoke the interviewee. In some way, excuse me, you need to approach the interview with humility. One of the challenges that we haven't really talked about to this point is learning how to discourage or learning about lying participants. Practice techniques to discourage your participant lying, and consider how lies might actually provide potential valuable data. Why did someone lie in response to your question? How can I pick up on whether someone is lying to me? Consider multiple voices and points of view through polyphonic interviewing. Practice via mock interviews. Check out the exercise on 8.2. It encourages role-playing comments and interview challenges. Finally, we move on to transcribing. Transcribing involves creating typewritten records of audio recording. Transcription is not awful, and it can actually improve interviewing skills. Researchers use a standard form of transcription symbols. There are no universal signals, but check out the Tips and Tools 8.3 for one version of the symbols that you could use. Remember that a more detailed transcription is not always better, And we need to think about who actually does the transcribing. Are you doing it? Are you finding a research assistant? Are you paying someone to do it? The time that takes to transcribe can vary depending on who does the transcribing, and of course based on the length of the recording. Transcription decisions impact the meaning of the data. So how a transcription is written may impact how we view the meaning of the interview or the focus group. And at the very least, if we're doing the transcription ourselves, we need to engage in fact checking. Let me go back. I meant if you're not doing the transcription yourself, then we need to engage in fact checking to make sure that what's been written down is accurate. And finally, last note, remember interviewing takes practice. Even the most seasoned interviewers face surprises. Interviews are a lot of work, but research magic can happen when two people come together with guided conversations. But practice, as I have said repeatedly, is crucial for improvement. So that's it for this learning unit. If you have any questions, as always, please contact me via email or post your questions under the virtual hours if it's about the content or anything within the class. And I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible.